Hello and welcome to the Completed Life Initiative's latest symposium, Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. This symposium asks the question, how do we navigate one of life's most transformative experiences, our dying?
Drawing inspiration from Australian poet Les Murray's observation that these kind of questions summon last hellos. Today's Global Symposium welcomes speakers from Australia to Belgium, the United States to Rwanda, as we explore new models in end-of-life and palliative care.
From the origin of what it means to be palliative in the context of Aboriginal communities, to the scientific inquiry into the effect of placebos, from research into personal narratives of end-of-life visions, to expanding eligibility considerations for medical aid in dying. This two-day symposium invites you to contemplate one of life's most powerful transformative experiences.
Your presence in this virtual space means a lot to us, and we are grateful for you tuning in today. Be sure to stay till the end of this presentation, as there will be an opportunity for you to join a Completed Life Initiative team member and your fellow symposium attendees at our virtual event cafe. Thanks for joining.
Hello, my name is Mark Barker Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of the Completed Life Initiative. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Last Hellos, New Models in Global End-of-Life Care. In this session, our theme is the wonder of perception, pondering the role of placebos. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Dr. Kathryn T. Hall. Kathryn is the Senior Vice President for Research at the New York Academy of Medicine. After receiving her PhD in microbiology and molecular genetics from Harvard University, she spent 10 years in the biotech industry, tackling problems in drug discovery and development. Dr. Hall then returned to Harvard Medical School, joining the Fellowship in Integrative Medicine at the Beth Israel Medical Center, and received an MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health. Before joining New York Academy of Medicine during the COVID pandemic, Dr. Hall served as the Deputy Commissioner for Population Health and Health Equity at the Boston Public Health Commission. Dr. Hall is an assistant professor, part-time in medicine at Harvard Medical School, and an associate molecular biologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Her academic research focuses on the placebo effect, and in particular, how the absence of placebo and presence of nocebo effects influences health equity. Dr. Hall is the author of Placebos, an MIT Press publication, and has a master's in documentary film from Emerson College. Kathryn, it is lovely to meet you. I'm such a big fan of your book. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I suspect for most of our audience, we have a vague sense of what a placebo is and does. We might have heard, for example, it's a sugar pill that somehow helps us feel better, but we're not sure how. To begin, I'm wondering if you might share where the word came from and a general definition of what a placebo is and does.
So the word comes from the Latin to please, and it really was used, it was actually a reference in the Bible, I will please the Lord in the land of the living. And it was part of honoring people who had died, a chant that was used, but as wealthy people were less interested in mourning, loudly mourning their dead, they hired mourners. And with this hiring of mourners, there was a sense that there was something artificial about that. And so the term singing placebos was, used early on to describe something fake to simulate something of great import. And that's essentially what placebos are used for. They are like pills or injections or even surgeries that are designed to simulate the real pill meaning the pill that has a drug or, you know, some chemical component that's left out. But everything else about the pill or the injection or the surgery remains the same. So if it's an injection, if it's a drug that's dissolved in saline, you just get the saline injection. And if it's a surgery, you just get the incision and maybe the smell of the chemicals and the kind of the surgeon with the mask and the gloves, but you don't get the actual intervention. And it's meant to simulate this very powerful intervention so that we can understand the benefit of the actual drug, the actual injectable, or the actual surgery.
That's really helpful. And in your book, I was pleased that you shared this story of how you sort of came to appreciate placebos as you went through an acupuncture situation to sort of tackle some carpal tunnel issues you had. Could you tell us a little bit about that story and how that sort of piqued your interest in placebos?
Absolutely. So ironically, I was at the time working in the pharmaceutical industry and really engaged in drug discovery. And so I, you know, worked in a lab and I would pipette. You know, a pipette is basically a device that we use to suck up small amounts of a solution and move it to another, from one tube to the other, basically. That when you're in the lab, back in my day, before there were robots to do all the pipetting for you, you did it by hand. And so between being on a computer and pipetting, I got carpal tunnels. And I was in so much pain, it was hard to work. And so I, you know, went to clinician after clinician, and I started off with, you know, just your general practitioner and ended up at a surgeon's office. And I was prescribed over this 1 year, almost 2 year period, actually, codeine, all kinds of, you know, pretty powerful painkillers. And it started to make me groggy. Nothing was really helping. The impact it was really more having was to kind of make me sleepy, make me fatigued, which was even more miserable. And so finally I went to a surgeon, and I, you know, and what she was recommending was, you know, this carpal tunnel surgery that sounded a little bit ominous, and it seemed like there must be something else I can do before I kind of make such a commitment to, you know, slitting my wrists, basically. And so, and a friend of mine had the surgery and it wasn't very successful. He still had the pain and he was wearing a brace. So a friend of mine who had throughout this time been saying, go see my acupuncturist, go see my acupuncturist. Finally, I was like, well, I have nothing to lose at this point. If I'm going to do surgery, with a knife, I can probably tolerate a pin. Let me just see if this is going to be at all helpful. So kind of to humor her, kind of as a last resort, I go to this acupuncturist. She's this very sage, elderly, older woman who, you know, like takes my pulses, looks at my tongue and kind of goes, like she's doing something. And I'm like, this is going nowhere. And so she has me lie down on this thing, you know, the massage kind of table, and then hops on the table and takes my arm and, you know, like jams a needle in my arm. And I have never felt so, first I was like busy wondering like, what the heck, she's on the table and there's a pin in my arm, and the pain that I experienced, it was almost like it shot through my arm and left. And I could not believe it, but at first I was like, this is ridiculous. But by the time I got off that table 25 minutes later, for the first time in all that time, I didn't have pain. And so, you know, I couldn't believe it. Like this made no sense to, you know, somebody who is a molecular biologist who makes drugs. But there it was. I was my own proof. And so that got me interested in acupuncture. And also in placebo, because was this acupuncture or was this a placebo effect?
And so just one side note, I noticed in your acknowledgments that you named your dog Placebo.
My dog is a placebo. We got him just before the pandemic, and the thinking was we would have him be a therapy dog, and we thought how lovely if his name was Placebo, and he would come into the room and you could pat him and he would be, your placebo. But unfortunately, COVID happened and he wasn't able to get trained, so he's our placebo.
So I thought it might be helpful to sort of unpack for our audience how placebos work. And maybe you could guide us through that. And the one part that I find fascinating is it feels like it's really aligned with expectations. And like Sylvia Plath, the poet, once said, if you expect nothing from somebody, you're never disappointed. But expectations, usually we have them. Our brains, as you and I think we share some similar reading affinities and scholars, but our brains are wired to predict what's going to happen. We go through life expecting things. And there's something about expectations and placebos that help explain them. In your book, you write, expectations are shaped by past experience and can be either positive or negative. Through placebo mechanisms, expectations can enhance or minimize the effects of treatment. Walk us through a little bit how expectations are part of the placebo effect or how they might work.
It's really, I think, a wonderful and exciting discovery that developed over time. Kind of started in the psychological domain and got, more investigated in the neurobiology, neuroimaging domains, and kind of, I think, really at this point, there's a lot of good evidence that expectation, as you said it, is a key driver of placebo effects. And so what is expectation? Expectation is your sense of what is about to happen next. It can be conscious or unconscious. Earlier on, we believed that the information about this pen, for instance, is the light going into my eye and going to my brain, and somehow I'm processing it and I, see an image of a pen and now I know there's a pen. But it's much more, and as you're looking this, you might be predicting that I've just, talked about a pen, and you're expecting that you could maybe, I could write something with this pen. So you have a lot of assumptions and expectations about this pen, but this is not a pen. This is a stylus. So you would had all these perceptions, and you would think that, like if I was writing away, I'd be writing on a piece of paper, but I wouldn't be. I'd be writing on this other pad that is, an electronic thing. So our brains are efficient, and rather than kind of do all this, physical processing, predict what it's seeing, predict what you're seeing, and how you should act in response to what you're seeing. And that allows us to not have to pay attention to everything as we drive home. And you don't even know how many red lights you go through, but you've managed to successfully stop. Well, hopefully no red lights, but you go through the green lights. You've managed to somehow stop at every red light, go through every green light, and you're not really paying attention unless somebody runs across the street or something happens that, now your brain kicks in and says, I need to pay attention to what is happening. So in placebos, we get conditioned, or we just have this, it's not necessarily even a formal conditioning. We have this sense that if I take this pill and I put it in my mouth, and I've been told that it's going to help my condition, that in actuality, it's going to start to help my condition. And that's the expectation factor. And certainly we see that if we give people, in a bottle with a label, something that is a painkiller, and we tell them this is going to help your pain, take it twice a day or take it once a day or take it with pain, that it will indeed have that effect. Now, if I modify your perception or your expectation that, and I say, this pill, it might also make you feel a little nauseous, you might feel a little dizzy, you might feel a little drowsy, it's been demonstrated that that actually will happen. It's like you get what you expect. So now I take the pill, I might get some pain relief. It's a sugar pill, but I also get a little drowsy. I also get a little dizzy. I also get a little nauseous. So yeah, what we expect, we get what we expect.
I really like, did you just make that up? You get what you
I did
expect?
not.
Because what I'm thinking about, like, this is a silly thing for me. You know, there's generic ibuprofen and there's the one that Advil or Motrin. And I know they're both the same, but my brain like predicts that I'm going to feel better with the known brand. Totally irrational. But I feel like my brain is predicting a better outcome with the name brand because I paid more money for it or whatever. And so I've thought in many ways, perhaps all of us have examples where we predicted something and you get what you expect.
Exactly. I'm even worse than you are because I need to have the blue capsule with the nice clear blue, you know, liquid inside. That will definitely help me much more than the white pill of the same drug.
Exactly, right? It's too
Yeah.
funny. And so just to recap that, because I think it's so important, and it took me a little while to understand this. So I'm not sure, maybe you're familiar with Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote about emotions, but her take was exactly the same. She says all the neurons in our brain are working to anticipate and to predict, so that we can expect an outcome. And what you're saying is placebos tap into that neurological process.
Exactly, and I would even, I like the way you put it, that placebos tap into that, because it's not, like, the placebo effect is not something unique to clinical trials. It's not something that's unique to the doctor-patient interaction. It's a way that we work to be efficient, so that we don't have to think through and process every piece of information, that we can just kind of go along with our expectations until we're rudely awakened by something that we miss, we didn't estimate correctly. Like we predicted that we didn't predict well that something was going to happen, and now something else happens. Now we need to pay attention. Now we can divert all that energy to paying attention to understanding how we want to update our prior expectation of what was going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And just to say it one more time, so I have it in my mind. If you hand me a pill that says this will alleviate your headache, your knee pain, whatever, my prediction process in my brain begins.
Exactly. And what's interesting there is you automatically know that you need to consider who is telling me this is going to help me. Is it my mother? Is it my trusted clinician? Is it the sketchy friend who's giving me a pill?
Right.
Is it, to your point, is it a generic? Is it even expired? Because, expiration dates are kind of one of those things that have a certain buffer time in them. So things actually work a little bit beyond the expiration date. But I know some people who, they never take that chance, and in their minds, even if it's like 1 month expired, it's not going to work.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. So I found it fascinating in your book, you give some examples. Maybe our audience is curious, like how effective are placebos? And I know a scholar you've worked with, Dr. Ted Kapchuk at Harvard Medical School, did a 2020 review where he said placebo responses range from moderate to large and account for a 50 to 75% of the benefits of drug treatments for pain. So they can make a difference when we're grappling with pain. He makes the point, placebos are never a cure, which is a different for it I'm kind of quackery medicine. You know, if you take this pill, you're going to be cured. His point is it's beneficial for certain ailments, and it's not 100%, but it is pretty effective. Can you walk us through that in regards to how effective placebos are?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in what Ted and what you just said.
Yeah, help us
Firstly,
with that.
it varies by individual, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
not everybody responds to placebo,
Hmm.
and we don't really fully understand when an individual who might respond to a placebo would respond to it. So for instance, if you take me, in my experience with my carpal tunnel syndrome, I went to clinician after clinician who gave me treatments that if I was going to have a placebo effect, maybe I would have had it, right? Before I got to the acupuncturist. Like, why didn't I have any benefit from all of that beyond the drug, just the placebo effect,
Right.
right? And you might argue, well, maybe acupuncture isn't placebo, and that's, certainly a lot of people would argue that. But so it's not just whether I'm a placebo responder or not, it's when am I a placebo responder, right? And is it condition dependent? Like if I have depression or pain, is it context dependent? Like if I get an injection, I'll have a bigger placebo response than if I have a pill. There are a lot of factors that go into whether or not somebody will respond to a placebo or not. So that's kind of one factor. The other interesting factor that I think Ted is talking about there is a cure, and kind of also the conditions. So for instance, I don't think anybody would argue with you if you said that placebos work for subjective outcomes, right? But then you might say, well, when does an outcome really become subjective? So, is blood pressure subjective? You measure it with, a blood pressure cuff and a sphygmometer, but there is a lot of evidence that some people when they're in the doctor's office, the stress of that can change their, blood pressure. And so you actually have to take it 3 times in the doctor's office and take the average of all 3 because it's varying so much depending on kind of when you kind of rushed in, you're nervous about, and then when you kind of settle down. So
Right.
there's so many factors that go into this. It's really hard to say, to predict kind of that range. So it's a very broad range.
Right.
And finally, there's a sense that it doesn't work for conditions like cancer, like placebos can't stop your cells from replicating. And, I certainly feel like I can't say yes or no. The study has not really been done because it's almost unethical to give somebody a placebo if they have cancer and if there's another treatment that's available, and it wouldn't be an ethical treatment to do. And it would be hard to argue that a placebo could stop your cells from replicating, or a placebo could stop a virus from replicating and, protect you from COVID. So I think there are limits, certainly significant and important limits of placebo that we need to pay attention to.
That's great. And I want to turn to how placebos might impact end-of-life care and options. But before we go there, there's 2 things I just wanted to your reflections on, which I find fascinating. That's called open label placebos. Walk us through the mystery and wonder of what an open label placebo might be.
And there, I think that's kind of the brilliance of TED, to kind of turn that whole thing on its head. So if you think about it, why would a placebo work, right? A placebo in a clinical trial would work because there is a belief that the patient or the person being treated has about the active drug, that it's going to benefit them. And so part of that belief is that the placebo doesn't work and that the drug works, right?
Right.
But the fact that we see 50 to 74% of people having a benefit from placebo suggests that on some levels, placebos do work. They do help some people.
Right.
So by giving people that information, giving people the real or the true or the accurate or the broader information about placebos, allows them the possibility to know that placebos work and to factor that, update their expectation that this thing that they're taking might have an impact or might have benefit to them. And so the whole concept behind open label placebos is to change the information that you're operating under, not in a way that's deceitful, but in a way that's honest. Open label placebos are also called honest placebos, to give you the facts, the data about placebo, and to allow your body to, select if it's going to observe and start interpreting and perceiving a benefit. And I love the story it's not the narrative, I should say, the narrative that's given to you when they're giving you open label placebos. It's that you don't have to believe that they're going to work, but you do have to adhere to the treatment. You do have to take it faithfully. And one of the things that's so interesting about that is there's so many studies that demonstrate that people who adhere to drug or placebo do significantly better than people who don't adhere. And even long after the trial is over, they come back and look at people who were more adherent to the treatment, whether it was placebo or drug, and they have less cardiovascular disease, sometimes even less recurrence of cancer. Like, adherence is a very powerful piece of this whole equation that we don't fully understand.
That's fascinating. And just way, way off the top of my head, does that mean because you are reinforcing the predictions that are happening, you're grooving the record more and more and more to accentuate the response of healing?
That is a very powerful hypothesis and one that I think should be tested. I don't think the placebo researchers are much more focused right now on understanding the neurological pathways that are involved. And it's very hard to test some of these hypotheses in the real world setting of clinical trials, where the clinical trial is just trying to get their drug to market.
Right. Walk us through nocebos, which is kind of the dark side, the shadow side of placebos. Walk us through what that is.
Yeah, I think that nocebos are absolutely fascinating, and that's when you get negative information and you have negative effects. So for instance, being told that if you're going to have nausea, that the particular drug in a trial, that particular drug causes nausea, drowsiness, and let's say fatigue. It's really fascinating to see that the people randomized and blinded and given placebo have the same side effects as the ones that they were told they were going to have, right? So that is why it's called the nocebo effect, because it's not like they go out and they have, knee pain or some other, they might have that, but that's what you see by and large, is that people have the side effects that they're told that they might receive or they might experience.
Right.
And similarly, that, and I want to say that's kind of why we're really interested in that patient-doctor interaction, because there's so much of an opportunity to kind of enhance the benefit of the treatment that you're being given, or to minimize the benefit of the treatment that you're being given by your words.
That's a perfect and fascinating segue to this question that you and I wrote about when we were checking in with each other via email, and that is, what can the role of placebo be in end-of-life care? Like, our symposium is really, the goal is to explore new avenues in how we take care of our loved ones and our patients in the medical community who are facing a terminal illness or a situation where end-of-life care is applicable. So, for example, we're looking at AI and end-of-life care, art and end-of-life care. What are your thoughts in regards to how placebos potentially or have or can impact end-of-life care options and treatment?
There's so much to tell about that story. Firstly, let's start with the historical perspective, right? So We know that, from documents, medical documents from, as far back as the 1700s, and I'm sure many interventions that used placebos preceded that physicians, doctors gave their patients placebos because there was nothing else to give them. And they know that, we know that often people had amelioration of their symptoms. And in my book, I recount a very interesting story of a colleague of mine who we were talking one day about placebos, and he said, "Oh, I remember that when my grandmother was dying, and his grandmother was dying in Iran." And they said and the clinician, the physician said, that she has about 2 weeks and let's start making arrangements. And the family was very upset because her son had been exiled and hadn't come back for years, and they needed time to get him back because it was very important for her to say goodbye to her son. And he said, okay, I have something I can give her. And he told them that they had, he had a new treatment, and that it had worked for many people. And, let's give it a shot and let's see if this can do it. Again, he had nothing else to give her. It's the end of her life. And he gave her a sugar pill. And she lived to see her son come home, and she was able to say goodbye to him, and he kind of confided them, and that's what he gave her. And I think that this is not unusual. Some people reach for what we call the impure placebo. So not the sugar pill or the bread pill of the past, but something that's, not necessarily known to work for that condition, a vitamin, a very low dose of a drug. And that's given to the patient and can oftentimes, be of service, is a quote from William Cullen, a 1700s clinician, be of service to the patient.
And there's so many aspects to that moving story that sort of pop up in my mind. Like, would an open label, if that person had known it was a placebo, would it have worked? Are you supposed to be upfront about that? The aspects to that story to think through are really interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think the ethics of placebos in general, and certainly at the end of somebody's life, are very complex and really important that we, keep front and center. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why there is a robust debate in the palliative care area, whether or not you could include somebody who's dying in a clinical trial. Because in a clinical trial, so let's put it this way: how do you know if there's a drug or a treatment that's going to work or benefit a patient without having done a trial on it? But if you do a trial, you basically have to ask somebody who's, dying if they're going to be in a clinical trial, and that, I think, is really complex, number one. And what we see oftentimes is that, the families kind of step in as they should, to kind of, depending on where they're at, they have interesting opinions on whether or not that's okay. Also, there's tremendous heterogeneity in that population of people who are dying. So, somebody who's dying from, cancer is different from who's dying from heart failure. So a treatment for death rattle, which is one of the ones that we see often in the literature, might have differential effects depending on, who it's being given to. And so to get a large enough population to have, say, something meaningful about a drug is hard in this population. So I think the ethics of, for instance, placebos, and just in the context of the care, but also in the context of clinical trials, gets very complex.
Yeah, I think, and thank you for guiding us through that. And I just, what popped in my mind is just, could there come a day where someone who's in end-of-life care situation, you're just sort of upfront and you say, here's a placebo. It might help you. You're just sort of upfront about that. And so, like, I found this quote somewhere in reading about this. I forget who said this, but the body has this internal pharmacy that relieves symptoms, and a placebo helps activate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's because we have this ridiculous word that we're stuck with, placebo, that I think for better or worse, probably for worse, has minimized the medical community's ability to really take it seriously. I think that's a disservice to patients because of the fact that tens of thousands of studies have been done on this treatment and that it's proved to be effective in significantly more trials than drugs that we've looked at. And I think that, when I think about placebos, when I think about like the context of clinical care, how long it takes to get an appointment, how long it takes a person to even call to get an appointment. When you finally call, they were like, depending on what your condition is, it could be like 1 week to 6 months, right?
Right.
When you finally get into that room and you kind of, smell the smells and see all the symbols and the signs and the white coats and you check in and now you're telling your story, and you're being examined and touched and talked to and measured with your, in this very thin robe. What we're actually saying is that all of that is meaningless. It's the little chemical in the drug, in the pill, which is ridiculous, right? Because you've gone through so much, you've taken your body through so much. To minimize all that and kind of ridicule it as placebo, I think does a disservice to all of that surrounds the treatment.
One of our speakers made a differentiation between sort of dying or end of life. It's not a medical experience, it's a human experience. And I think in your description of us as a patient in a doctor's office, that's a human situation as much as it is a medical and pharmacological, if that's the right word, experience. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. I think that's at the end, that's really all we have is our humanity. And so honoring it and being open about it, I think is the best way. I do think, though, it's not the time to introduce placebos. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the time. Like, we need to do
Right.
that now, as you're doing now, to kind of start educating people. So somebody could even say, can you give me a placebo? Because I don't want all the side effects at this point. Right? I don't want to feel nauseous or drowsy or fatigued. I just want to, have some relief. And just think about it. If we could, have end-of-life treatments that don't have these side effects, how much more thoughtful and caring would that be?
Absolutely. And to circle around to this idea that we have this internal pharmacy inside of us there to relieve symptoms, if there's some way to tap into that human element, how could that not be a good thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking at some of the palliative care studies that have been clinical trials, and one of them was for the death rattle. And it was really interesting how when they interviewed the patients and the practitioners, some practitioners said that treating the death rattle was as much for the family and the staff who
Yeah.
have to hear it as it is for the patient. And then I think the other thing that was really interesting there is that some family members actually felt that their loved one would have been proud of making this contribution at this time in their life. Like they were
Right.
okay with being part of the trial from a completely different perspective, which to me was unexpected.
Right.
But again, speaks to the humanity and the complexity that's present in these spaces.
Yeah. If there's one thing that our audience might consider doing in regards to placebos, is there something you might recommend for those of us who are curious to explore placebos outside of purchasing your great book?
Well, I think that really being open to exploring and understanding them is really, I think, the first step. They're not scary, they're not harmful, and at the end of the day, you can always, if it's not working for you, do something else. And you know, I had a motto. I love to kind of come up with slogans that if I have another life, I'll be a marketing person because I'm really fascinated with how our brains kind of click around slogans. But if I had one, it would be placebo first.
Excellent.
Placebo first, like why not? You have nothing to lose.
You get what you expect. Placebos
Get what you
first.
expect. Placebo first, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time. What a delightful conversation. Really appreciate you guiding us through placebos. And again, if people are curious, your book's a wonderful introduction to that. And we're grateful for you to introduce this idea of how can placebos impact end-of-life care. Feels like there's more work to be done, more conversations, and thank you for opening that door for us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks, Kathryn. Appreciate
Take
it.
care. Bye-bye.